Hey, okay, I hope everybody finds their way back in. This is I Read Old Magazines. Subscribe. We're going to be talking about Dyer, with the wider movement associated with Dyer, with the Michael Jones, with the Le Pen movement, all these guys. Um, it's around European Eurasianism and the destruction of the Augustinian tradition of the West. Um, okay, we got our first viewer. So I'm not just talking to myself. We had some technical difficulties, and so just briefly, we already did like half the show, um, but nah, yeah, we're live again. Live spelled backwards is evil though, so remember that. Yeah, I guess Google crashed. Google Chromebook. So but anyway, I started out. I suggested the book, and I guess John Brissan's back in. Welcome, John and Bader. Um, I started out suggesting the book from Routledge. Routledge does great stuff, especially intelligence studies that are not they're not like partisan or like the one I had on the Congress for Cultural Freedom from Routledge. Basically said, yeah, it was run by CIA agent Michael Josselson. Um, Uh, but I was suggesting the book at tango-nord.com. Go look at the pictures. It documents the pan-European movement all the way through Alexander Dugin, the Le Pen movement, their connections with Islamofascism, and some of the Eastern European nationalist movements, all stemming from a pan-European movement that started with Oswald Mosley. Um, I guess it might be a parallel movement or a counter pan European movement to the Kalergi Otto Habsburg plan. But yeah, so hopefully the feds don't shut me down again. Um, I cannot digitally quarantine myself. I cannot stay away from social media. I got to talk to somebody. I'm very desperate. So, but we're going to be reading this article, which I actually now have the PDF here with me, so I'm not going to waste your time. But seriously, I do recommend that book. It's at tango-noir.com. It's called the Russia and the European uh, Extreme Right or something. Go to the website, please. It's actually really good. Lots of documentation, etc. And it's from an academic source. So I mean, people cannot call you a conspiracy theorist if you run around and show that book to everybody. Um, So yeah, it's the article we're going to be reading today, the Iuzhinskii Circle, Far Right Metaphysics in the Soviet Underground and Its Legacy Today. And this is by Marlene L'Oreal. Um, I picked three articles that showed some merit, and I think we're just going to read one because this has a 36-minute reading time. But it'll just bring up some plot holes which we might have missed. Now, let me explain my beautiful. So if give me a like and subscribe if you like my beautiful icons that I'm making now um, on something that most people use to make stupid Tumblr and Instagram pics. I think I do a pretty good job for a very limited media application. So, um, but on it you have the National Bolshevist symbol, etc. But that scene that you're seeing there, that's Alan de Benoit, who's a pagan, and the Satanist believer, old Orthodox believer, Alexander Dugin. Alan de Benoit is the founder of the Nova Droit in France, the New Right, um, closely aligned with Le Pen and all these people. Extremely anti-Christian, but both Dugin and the Benoit share the Orthodox concept of the Imperium that Jay Dyer is always talking about, and also the concept of the nous. And they wished to destroy the Augustinian Platonic tradition in the West of reason and replace it with the what Alain de Benoit calls the Dionysian heart of hearts. But this is on a Russian Orthodox TV channel, just like we see with Zargrad of Konstantin Malafiev and his close connections with the former KGB General Leonid Reshetnikov. Alexander Dugin is also heavily involved in that. And our old friend AJ, Alex Jones, is keeping the frog straight in Russia now because he's on this Zargrad platform. But this is the Spots platform. I think it's owned by a different guy, but it's a Russian Orthodox TV channel, and they're promoting the Satanist and this pagan. So this is something very common in the Russian Orthodox tradition, especially the Neo-Orthodoxy, which I talk about, from people that called themselves Christian Theosophists, the Berdyaev and Solyov. So that's where I'm coming from, and let's get on with the article. The 2014 Ukrainian crisis enabled many Russian nationalist figures to step into the breach opened by the Kremlin and enter the media limelight. To the surprise of many Western observers, the majority of the far right and populist parties in Europe gave their unwavering support to Russia's actions in Ukraine. I did as well. I'm going to admit that. And I still do. Ukraine isn't a real country. But anyway. And they gave their lauds to Russian President Vladimir Putin. The ideological solidarity was facilitated by figures close to the Russian Orthodox Church, which has been working for years on a rapprochement with Western conservative circles, and by ideologues such as Alexander Dugin, a prolific writer known for borrowing from a variety of European fascist theories, as well as Bolshevik theories. Dugin's attraction to far right thinking often seems to have come from nowhere. He was expelled from PIMAT in 1989. It means memory. It was the group that was trying to canonize Dostoevsky as an Orthodox saint. He was kicked out for his Nazi sympathies, and mind you, this is a Soviet group. And then began his career as a prolific writer promoting Eurasianist geopolitics. In fact, his embrace of fascist theories began in the Soviet period, more precisely in Moscow, Bohemian underground. And this Bohemian underground had existed since before the Bolshevik Revolution, supported by the white emigre. The Russian avant-garde artists that became popular in one sector of Soviet society um, were these more conservative Nietzschean type artists. Um, and actually, like Leninist, Stalinist era, was actually more interested in classical art, which is kind of a paradox that most people in the West don't understand. But Lenin thought this stuff was absolutely horrible. Um, Dugin was shaped at a very young age by Iuzhinskii, or Golovin circle. I call it the Lenin Library Club because that's where they met, which since the 1960s had consistently tried to anchor in Russia the European religious and philosophical doctrines that inspired fascism and esoteric Nazism. The circle, what else is called the circle? Sought to move beyond the classical discourse on Russia's distinctive path by counterbalancing it with broader references coming from European metaphysical and traditionalist doctrines. The Golovin Circle has been mentioned in the works devoted to Dugin's career, including those by Andreas Umlad, Stephen Shenfield, Anton Shekovstov, and Mark Sedgwick. But the information on it's often sparse, and the circle seems to be kind of a prologue to Dugin's ideological engagement. However, the Golovin Circle deserves a full treatment in its own right as part of the history of Soviet intellectual underground westernizing liberals and Russian nationalists whose struggle constituted the dominant ideological contest within the dissident milieu. It then shows how the circle's preoccupation with esoteric mysticism mutated into an increasing engagement with the ideas of the European far right, which enabled the circle to become one of the crucibles of post Soviet Russian fascism. I divide history into four phases: around Yuri Mamlev in the 1960s, around Yevgeny Golovin and Gaider Djamal in the 1970s, around Dugin himself in the 1980s, and around the revival of the group Social Network in the late 1990s and 2000s. Reconstructing the history of the circle is challenging, with the sources consisting mainly from excerpts from memoirs and interviews with the key players, but as personal histories, they are subject to being written by their authors who enjoy playing up the provocative image and nonconformist legacy of the circle. Mamlev's Metaphysical Salon. This is chapter 1. By releasing nearly 5 million prisoners from prison camps, de-Stalinization drastically altered the everyday Soviet social fabric of the 1950s. And it was the Stalin era that kicked out most of the Rokor white emigre. A lot of these people, the conservative Bolsheviks, um, who were in Russian Orthodox circles or Russian Orthodox themselves, supported the 1917 revolution. And I always bring up that one nun that tried to assassinate uh, Trotsky as an example. Um, anyway, as Anna Akhmatova remarked, two Russias will be eyeball to eyeball: the one that put people into the camps and the one that was put in them. De-Stalinization, and especially the cultural thaw that followed it, also deeply transformed Soviet intellectual milieus. The underground groups, hitherto clandestine since participating in them, imperiled members and their families, were able to formalize gradually into dissident circles or salons. They were open to larger number of members and used a range of methods to determine the meeting place, time, and discussion topic. The ideological diversity of these circles quickly confirmed the multiplicity of political opinions among Soviet dissident intellectuals. Liberals who looked to the West determined monarchists, Leninists, and Trotskyites who called for a return of the revolutionary roots of the Bolshevik regime, and Stalinists who denounced Khrushchev's fall. As the years went on, their discussions crystallized around two main axes. The first focused on the questions of human rights and religious freedoms and included a broad ideological spectrum of groups, ranging from pro-Western liberals to anarchists. The second was comprised of intellectuals who were interested in cultural debates and preserving the Russian national heritage. The second axis is also presented a broad political spectrum, one that stretched from Romanov monarchists, remember Rokor and all those individuals hanging out with the Romanovs in their New York City palace apartment around George de Morgshield and yeah, that whole thing. Um, Monarchists to those nostalgic for Stalinism. This latter movement is the most ideologically and politically complex, since it maintained close contacts with some official circles inside the state structure, the Communist Party and the Komsomol. From the late 1950s, early 1960s through the 1970s, part of the Soviet establishment gradually adopted Russian nationalist theories. Under the informal name of the Russian Party, a group of senior officials enabled nationalist dissident claims to gain gradual acceptance. In the early 1960s, a third, more marginal dissident axis emerged. It gathered together the neither nor group, that is, those who criticized the Westerners just as much as reading his novels, to a narrow group of admirers who met at the Lenin Library smoking room and other various locations, including Mamlev's tiny one-bedroom flat on Iuzhinskii's Perelok, into which up to 50 people would crowd. I wish libraries still had smoking rooms. Could burn a lot more books that way. I'm just kidding. That's the only way I can read is by smoking, chain smoking. After the building was razed in 1968, the circle met in the apartments of different members, mostly Golovin, Djamal, and Vladimir Stepanov, but kept the name of the original street, the Iuzhinskii Circle. Mamlev's group was ideologically close to another salon run by painter Yuri Titov and his wife, Elena Stroeva, a circle that was equally virulent in its criticism of the Soviet regime and sought non-political alternatives, mainly in art. The Mamlevians gathered regularly at the home of Rubina Eritiyuyan, who was the muse of the Mayakovka dissident circle in the 1950s 60s, and then organizer of the underground exhibitions in 1970. Eritiyuyan lived next door to the Titovs. Other salons called the Mamlevians Satanists. Indeed, Mamlev's novels criticize the Soviet system through the metaphor of monstrosity. Their heroes are characterized by extreme violence, sadomasochism, and satanic practices, and they combine all kinds. Okay, so this isn't satanic panic. This isn't satanic panic. This is academic paper here. Psychopathologies. The underlying theme is the extreme experiences are needed to transcend the mediocrity of everyday life. These experiences, this is the teaching of Gurdjieff. I don't know if Dmitry Mitronovic, the Serbian futurist, trained Alan Watts, who trained Father Seraphim Rose. Um, the underlying theme is that extreme experiences are needed to transcend the mediocrity of everyday life. These experiences grant access to a metaphysical reality and drive human beings to their internal state of logic, revealing the fundamental absurdity of the human condition. Clown World. Manleaf has been sometimes disproportionately compared with Dostoevsky, due to sharing the same pursuit for human complexity in the darkness of his soul. His cult novel The Sublimes in 1966 is considered to be a metaphor for the activities of the Golovin circle at that time and for a practice the writer dubbed sexual mysticism. Recall Alexander Dugin being called a piss drink around Muscovite intellectuals and artists seeking philosophical principles applicable to the Bohemian spirit and practice. Manleaf and his early supporters recalled the revolutionary effect produced by the appearance of the Moscow scene of such figures as Manleaf, who some called the Soviet Catholic. The Circle's core group did not meet exclusively to read Manleaf's novels. They also discussed the banned books they could obtain, in particular those linked to metaphysics, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, magic, astrology, that is, a set of theories based on the existence of a parallel reality. And half of the 1950s and throughout the 1960s, Western esoteric works were not only classified as politically subversive and were still freely available at the Lenin Library. Only later did they join the special collection of prohibited books, Spetskron, the work of Elena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and Peter Ouspensky, that's Gurdjieff's disciple, right-hand man, began spreading through some of the underground salons from the end of 1950s. Thanks to the influence of the Circle and similar groups, George I. Gurdjieff became one of the more fashionable authors of the time. Gurdjieff was the founder of a mystical teaching called the Fourth Way. Oh, wow, Fourth Way, Fourth Dimension, Fourth Political Theory of Alexander Dugin, which Ouspensky later theorized in his own works, particularly The Fourth Dimension, 1909. I was going to bring this up before. Trump's four-dimensional chess. Oh, gee, where are these memes coming from? The doctrine claims to address human beings' possibilities for inner development and transcend the body to achieve a higher state of consciousness. The rediscovery of Gurdjieff in the Soviet Union cannot be attributed solely to Manleaf, that was a Freudian slip. Fyodor P. Verofin also contributed to circulating the writings of Gurdjieff and Nikolaev Berdyaev, the guy that said that the Soviet Empire was the new Holy Roman Empire. Even before the Second World War, he continued spreading them once he returned from the Gulag in 1950s. In the following decades, three groups of Gurdjieff's followers were active. Those around Boris Kardemoun and poet-painter Vladimir Golovin, who sought contacts with Sufi orders. Oh, wow, why are the Sufis always coming up when we talk about Orthodoxy? In Central Asia, those around Kalitanko and Korshakov, and the major group around Vladimir Stepanov, a member of the Golovin Circle. At the start of the 1970s, the political atmosphere in the Soviet Union became more constrained, and the crackdown on dissident circles intensified. Manleaf decided to emigrate after the Soviet Union passed a law in 1973 that made sending any samizdat manuscript abroad punishable with several years in prison. He managed to leave the country the following year during the first large wave of immigration authorized by Moscow thanks to the detente. Unlike many dissidents such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I can never say that word the first time, Manleaf never complained about his American years and is said to have quickly adapted to life in the United States. He then settled in Paris, as all of these occultists from Russia do. They go back and forth between Paris and Russia. In 1983 and became an important figure in Russian emigre circles and anti-Soviet political groups. He emerged as one of the principal representatives of Russian postmodernism and developed the theory of metaphysical realism. Once he emigrated, Manleaf played an important role in spreading with dissident circles the emigre almanac Occultism e Ioga, which was funded by Alexander M. Asiev, 1902-1933. A medical doctor by training who was fascinated by the teachings of Agni Yoga, Asiev started a correspondence with Nikolai Rurik in 1933. In 1933, he began the Occultism Iola Almanac, which was first published in Belgrade and closely supervised by Nikolai's spouse, Elena Ririk. The almanac became famous among emigre groups for publishing correspondence between Assiev and Ririk. After World War II, Assiev migrated to Paraguay and resumed publishing the almanac until 1977. Hope I'm not losing you. It's getting kind of boring. These are names that are kind of dumb. Not really important. Mamleev himself published several articles on Buddhism, Hinduism, and the Western New Ageism and helped circulate it in the Soviet Union. In his first years, the Golovin Circle occupied a unique place in the Muscovite Bohemian underground by avoiding the sterile Slavophile versus Westerners debate that then dominated the dissident space. It provided a restricted number of followers access to a hitherto unknown European pantheon of doctrines and beliefs and parallel metaphysical realities that would allow one to mentally escape the Soviet regime and way of life. Mamleev is often presented as the first to introduce into the Soviet Union previously unknown European theoreticians of traditionalism, such as Rene Guénon and Julie Savola. I don't know if that's necessarily true, given how close these individuals, uh, at least Guénon was to, well, they both were very close to the Maestra circles, but they came kind of far afterwards, so who knows? However, description of these discoveries barely exist and seem to be attributable to two of his friends and disciples, Yevgeny Golovin and Dyer Jamal, who embody the circle's second generation. In the mid 1960s, a second generation of leading figures emerged within the circle, dominated by the trio Yevgeny Golovin, Dyer Jamal, and Vladimir Stepanov. They became the engines of the circle once Mamleev left the USSR. The circle evening gatherings constituted to organize Dionysian initiations featuring vast quantities of alcohol and sex that were supposed to grant access to another level of human reality, with Golovin as their main mastermind. The anti Soviet creed remained the circle's driving force, and all modes of refusing Soviet normality were welcome. Some authors who later became famous cut their teeth in the group, such as Vladimir Sorokin, Viktor Erofeev. I've heard of Sorokin, and Viktor Pevlin, as well as the jazz musician Boris Grebenshikov. The disciple of Gurdjieff, Arkady Rovner. I've heard of Rovner as well. I think he's one of the oligarchs. I can't remember. And painter and film director Valery Konoplev. As it did in early years, the group seemed to attract around 50 regular followers, as many of the 30 persons would convene at Dijamal's Dasha in weekends. Golovin himself was a poet, not a systematic theoretician or a political thinker, and worked as a translator and literary critic for the so-called thick journals of the time. Under his influence, one of the hallmarks of the Circle's evenings became poetry readings. Members faithfully recited Rimbaud and Baudelaire, the founder of cultural modernism. He coined modernité, um, and is specifically one of the targets of the Oath Against Modernism. Schleiermacher being the founder of um, theological modernism and Catholicism, but Baudelaire actually says that Joseph de Maistre was his main influence. Joseph de Maistre taught him how to think, and that modernism is not in opposition to tradition, but the tradition of the new. Still a traditionalist. People fail to make that connection, and that's why they misunderstand modernism. It did not come out of liberalism. Um, Golovin also gave new impetus to the musical activities of the circle. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, his poems were put to music by Vasily Shumov and his band Dissenter, by Alexander Skalayer and his band Vabank, and the Vyacheslav Butusov and his band, Kino. In 1997, Golovin devoted an entire work to center the sentimental fury of rock and roll. His eccentric views earned him a role as a hero in Mamleev's The Sublimes, and saw him represented as the character of the Admiral, a nickname he had given himself in Konstantin Serebrov's novel Mystical Underground, The Hermetically Sealed School, released 2002. And you recognize with all of these orthodoxy circles, they're extremely Nietzschean, just like the Uriyev school that I talk about in Vichy, France. They believe that Christianity has deviralized men, and so they have to go through with these kind of crazy, wild pursuits, um, masculine pursuits like death metal and what have you. And you notice that Jay is around all of these avant-garde type bands. And that fundamentally comes out of a Dionysian, Nietzschean worldview of the Russian Orthodox. He doesn't have to believe everything that Nietzsche said. It is these little shit seeds that Nietzsche had planted. And if you don't go in and weed them out, then they stay there. It doesn't matter. You're still influenced by an individual, even if you nominally say that you're not. Little information has been handed down about the methods that the Circle used to obtain banned literature. Soviet control over banned literature grew, and the Lenin Library Spectron became less accessible to anybody outside of a selected group of privileged people. Working as a translator of the West in literature, Golovin could have accessed some of these books, but like other dissident groups, the Circle developed alternative strategies to obtain Western products. One way was to make contact with Western diplomats in their offices in Moscow or with occasional visitors to the USSR. I'm smelling a foreign intelligence, British intelligence operation. Philologist Mikhail Milak, 1944, a disciple of Gurdjieff and specialist in medieval troubadour literature, often visited hotels reserved for foreigners in the hope of obtaining banned works, which led to the authorities arresting him at several occasions. Another way to send requests to Western publishers sympathetic to dissidents, such as the YMCA Press in Paris, run in conjunction with Nikolai Berdyaev. Um, Vladimir Stepanov, for instance, wrote to several Western publishers to ask for works unavailable in the Soviet Union. He was also in contact with Gurdjieffians abroad, such as John Bonnet, a British scholar, diplomat, and likely member of MI6 British intelligence services. Gee, wow. And Idris Shah, an Afghan born in India and teacher in the Sufi tradition. Both Bennett and Shaw were convinced that Sufism and inspired traditionalist higher knowledge. They met each other in 1962 and worked together for several years in spreading Gurdjieffian teachings in Europe and the Soviet Union. However, there's no information that explains how they made contact with members of Moscow's underground intelligentsia. Dijmal played a crucial role within the Golovin circle by collecting foreign or banned books and reproducing them as samizdat. In an interview with Vladimir Posner in late 2013, Dugin mentioned that in 1967 and 68, Golovin had owned only one of René Guénon's books, but that by 1970, he himself had succeeded in having sent several of them from Paris and amassing an almost complete collection, which, however, had been destroyed in a fire in his apartment in 1973. In his memoirs, Dugin friend Vladimir Vitamin, a Tallinn based dissident very active in samizdat world, mentioned several times Dugimol's library at home, describing shelves filled with reprinted copies of Samizdat, including texts by Gurdjieff on the Fourth Theory, banned works, and Korans. In the 1980s, Dugimol was close with some friends, with some French diplomatic personnel who transported forbidden books through diplomatic pouch. Within Golovin and Dugimol's, such as Arthur Rimbaud, Mallarme, Rilke, Latremont, and Baudelaire, Golovin first discovered alchemy and Hermeticism in the mid-1950s, at the early age of 16. This was well prior to his meeting with Mamlev, which occurred in the second half of the 1960s. In an interview with Elementi, Golovin declared, "I did not have any teachers," thus clarifying that he did not consider Mamlev to be his maître à penser. Dugin confirmed this by remembering that Golovin considered himself to be the first to have introduced Guénon to the Soviet Union, which implies that Mamlev did not know him, or at least was not very familiar with his work. Golovin recounted that he found Guénon's Crisis of Contemporary World by chance in the Lenin Library Spectron in 1963 or 1964. Reading this book, which had been completely unknown to him, had an electric effect. It allowed him to understand that Oriental mysticism, until the main version of mysticism available in the Soviet Union, should be put aside in favor for Western medieval mystical traditions. Interesting. Guénon's traditionalism affirms that the most authentic era of human history was the steady in its religious, philosophical, and social principles until the school of thought started disappearing with the advent of the modernity in the 16th century. There's that Renaissance hate. For Guanan, all religions and esoteric traditions, regardless of their concrete practice, reveal the existence of now extinct primordial sacred tradition shared by all. During the 1930s, his ideas were developed in Italy, Germany, and Romania, and traditionalism became one of the main catchwords for fascist minded spiritualist groups. But in the early 1970s, Golovin became disenchanted with Guinan and moved on to other thinkers. Traditionalism, considering that the monotheistic feature made it too rhetorical and schematic, and that the only pre Christian esotericism had succeeded in preserving the very essence of alchemy and magic, that is, the belief in plurality of the realities. Golovin then discovered Julius Evola, particularly the Hermetic tradition, at the Lenin Library. He said that at the first the Italian author seemed less convincing than Guinan and even more obscure. Evola is best known for denunciation of the egalitarian born from the Enlightenment and the decadence of Western civilization. He appeals for a primordial rebirth of humanity via the original tradition, which, according to him, combines Hermeticism, metaphysics, sexual mysticism, and many components borrowed from Eastern religions. In Evola, Golovin also discovered a politically engaged Italian author who refused to follow Mussolini's fascist party of the time because he found it too centrist. Evola instead promoted the German conception of spiritual races, which Mussolini propagandists did not support, and after World War II provided ideological support to the extreme right wing terrorist acts that shook Italy during the Cold War era strategy of tensions. Um, Interestingly enough, I was working on a completely other thing, and one of the major guys is a descendant of the here. I got to involved in the strategy of tension. Let's see if we can find this. So Pius VII, who uh, revives the Jesuits in this kind of collaboration with Napoleon. Now, Napoleon, everybody knew, was a Freemason. Napoleon, everybody knew, had this occult advisor, Fabre d'Olivet, and Joseph de Maistre as advisors. Um, Pius VII was the House of Bracci, and the House of Bracci produced the major general behind the strategy of tension called Magi Bracci. So that was just an interesting little aside there. But before that, Clement XIV had determined the Jesuits were a fifth column in the church, and that the Jesuits were practicing uh, the traditions of other cultures in order to like synthesize the religion in order to convert. And they were also basically running colonies to pad their pockets, especially in Latin America. And this is exactly what Napoleon III tries to reinstitute when he puts the Habsburg puppet Maximilian I into Mexico, in line with Albert Pike's uh, Confederacy. So, yeah. Some things just don't change. Um, no source indicates what information was available to the Circle at that time on Evola's post-war activities. Through Evola and Guinan, the Circle assessed a wide range of Western theoreticians and promoters of occultism from the 19th century, such as Eliphas Levi, Alphonse and Louis Constant, Papus Gerard and Kos, Angela Vincent Enacos, and Carl Duprel. Golovin, Manleave, and Dejamal, it is impossible to identify their precise roles, also seem to have introduced members of the Circle to the works of Titus Burckhardt and Fritjof Schuon, both Swiss Germans and eminent members of the so-called traditionalists, um, then editor of the French newspaper Le Figaro magazine. This was the guy that was the Aldous Huxley of France that introduced LSD into France, but was also member of the alt-right, of the New Right, a founding member of the New Right, um, and a disciple of Gurdjieff, uh, and a member of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Uh, Published in French in 1960 and translated in English in 1963, Morning of Magicians quickly became a classic for conspiracy theories and the role of occult societies in world politics. It was one of the first works to describe emphatically the close links between Nazism and occult theories. No information is available on how the Circle came across this work, but we do know that first excerpts of the Morning of Magicians available in Russia were published in Nauka I Religia in 1966. However, neither Mamlev nor Golovin would need to wait for a Russian translation in order to get access to this text, as both could read French and English. It is thus impossible to say whether the Circle discovered Paul Wells through the journal or before it. What remained to be investigated are the motivations of Naku e Religia editorial board for this publication and why they selected extracts specifically concerning the esoteric context of Nazism. Driven by Golovin and Dejamal, the second generation of the Circle went further than Mamlev in its search for political ramifications of Western traditionalism and for the counter ideologies to the Soviet doctrine. German philosophers, especially Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Heidegger, became a must on the list of the Circle's philosophical discussions. Dejmal seems to have played a crucial role in this German turn. His maternal grandfather, high ranking party member, was a German language professor, and the younger Dejmal became familiar with a certain number of German authors rather early thanks to the grandfather's unique library. In interview with Posner, Dejmal acknowledged that, contrary to many other Circle members, he had arrived at traditionalism through German philosophy rather than Oriental mysticism. In another interview, he said he discovered Nazi mysticism through Armin Moeller. Moeller was close to Ernst Junger and the author of The Conservative Revolution in Germany, 1918 to 1932, a key work on the post-Nazi ideological overhaul of the far right in Germany, which influenced the German New Right movement. Let's check the chat. Please post article and link. No. This is my material. Find your own. Here, I put it in chat and we'll post it in other thing too. I don't know who else is watching. I hope John's back. John's still sitting waiting for me to start up. I can't believe this didn't pull in more people though. It's got a flashy name. Nude conspiracies. Alien bioduplication. Lyndon LaRouche was right. Alright. The Circle's participants also discovered the previously unknown worlds of the extreme right regimes during the Second World War, right-wing terrorism during the Cold War, and the experiences of Latin American counter-revolutionaries. Both Golovin and Dejmal referred to three authors as having a structural influence on their ideological evolution: Claudio Muti, Miguel Serrano, and Mircea Eliade. Muti is an Italian representative of the New Right and participated in many pan-European organizations such as Young Europe. That is a rehashing of the Freemasonic Grand Orient Freemason Mazzini's Young Europe organization, Young Italy organization, and the Confederacy's Young America organization associated with Mazzini, which sought to reconstruct fascist movements after the war. He defended Franco Giorgifreda, whose conviction in Piazza Fontana bombing was later overturned for lack of evidence. Muti then touted the Libyan regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, whom he saw as an Islamic embodiment of traditionalism and converted to Islam. Today, Muti remains a major ally and promoter of Dugin in Italy. Miguel Serrano, a Chilean diplomat, was an important theoretician of anti-modernism. He described his ideology as esoteric Hitlerism, inspired by Gnosticism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that he reproduced with elements inspired by Hindu traditions and references to Aryan descendants of the Hyperborea. Serrano returned to the Chile after the Pinochet coup in 1973 and criticized the new regime for being too centrist. He maintained correspondence with neo-Nazis in Europe and was an important figure for Nazi sympathizers in Chile. In another realm, Iliad, whose works profoundly influenced the European sociology of religion and myths, in particular concerning the distinction between the sacred and the profane, also developed a mythological thinking inspired by Guinan and Evola. Iliade, I think it's Iliade, was a fervent supporter of the Iron Guard in 1930s-40s Romania, praised the movement's fascist ideology, and enrolled in its political arm, Totul Pentru Tara, everything for the country. During the Second World War, he traveled into occupied Europe to support occupation regimes and celebrated the establishment of the Salazar regime in Portugal. Golovin was a provocative figure. He published under the pseudonym Alexander Sternberg, probably a reference to Baron von Eugen Sternberg, a general of the White Army who liberated Mongolia from Chinese domination, massacred Bolshevik supporters, converted to Buddhism, and endorsed the revival of the Mongolian Empire of Genghis Khan. Golovin appreciated the carnival-like character of references to Nazism, in his provocative taste in the conformist Soviet Union of stagnation years. He was also attracted to some political aspects of these ideologies. At the end of the 1970s and the start of the 1980s, Golovin presented the Circle as a SS Black Order, established a hierarchy among the members, and instituted a Masonic-style initiation ritual, with the addition of alcohol. He wrote a hymn for the Black Order and proclaimed himself the Reichsfuhrer. The reference to the Black Order allowed the Circle to denounce the egalitarian ideology of the Soviet regime, which then was equated with the mediocrity of Soviet life, to question its roots in the Enlightenment and Christianity, and to call for a return to a pagan and Aryan society where men innately belong to the hierarchies or castes. At the end of the Perestroika years, Golovin is said to have edited 2 issues of the almanac, Splendor Solis, Blesk Solska, a title inspired by Alchemist Almanac from the 16th century, the initials of which SS revealed Golovin's admiration for Nazi-inspired occultism. In his interview with Vladimir Posner, de acknowledged that he and Golovin considered Manley's view to be too aesthetic and literary and unable to take stock and full ideological scope of the readings. The Circle generated second generation active in second half of the 1960s through 1970s, gave mere preeminence to the philosophical and political interpretations of their West European discoveries. Several factors can explain this politicization. One is the greater access to banned text thanks to the Samizdat, but also the increased permissiveness of Soviet censors concerning nationalist themes and certain hitherto banned esoteric authors. The topic of cosmism, for example, made it possible to make more major pre-revolutionary authors, such as Nikolai Fedorov, semi-official, and to rehabilitate the occult side of the space conquest ideology promoted by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Alexander Chisevsky. Interesting thing, Russian cosmism. Maybe we'll talk about it someday. But I will say, when Jay Dyer is coming from, he doesn't talk about the traditionalist threat. He always talks about the apartment, how society's heading towards the apartment above Target, or the R2D2 sex robot that you're going to have following you around. But this is the typical Golovin Circle traditionalist argument against cosmism, which Dugin makes that huge distinction that cosmism is one form of Satanism that they oppose. Now, Dugin himself is obviously a Satanist, but he hides under the guise of being an old believer Russian Orthodox. But yeah, just wanted to make that point. Cosmism kind of equates to technocracy for the Anglo-American establishment. And that's what people like Jay Dyer, they blow the little dog whistle and call that out, technocracy, technocracy, technocracy. But this is no such threat. These kinds of things don't exist. The CNP doesn't exist. Dignitatis Humanae Institute, not a problem. Dugin and Alain de Benoit, not a problem. Pan-Europeanism, not a problem. Going on. The anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic propaganda of the 1970s also helped normalize the rediscovery of the Aryan past of the Slavic peoples, discreetly promoted in journals such as Naku I Religia and Technika Molodetsia. Next, interaction with Western diplomats working in Moscow increased during these years, and the amount of books available to well-organized dissident groups grew. Last but not least, a provocative atmosphere amenable to cultivation of taste for prohibited ideologies convinced younger generations to develop a more political vision of far-right metaphysics. The Golovin Circle 3.0, Dugin's Nazi-stained ideology. Alexander Dugin, who was born in 1962, represents the third generation of the Golovin Circle, which would endure the collapse of the Soviet Union and seek to harness the politically mobilizing potential of the Circle's ideological repertoire. Dugin likely met Gaidar Jamal in 1980, who then introduced him to the Circle. His presence in 1980 is noted by Vladimir Wiedemann in his memoirs. The following year, Dugin published in Samizdat a German-to-Russian translation of Evolis Pagan Imperialism. It is likely that the first version already had circulated among the Circle's members, and the translated had been a collective work compiled by Dugin. At that time, Dugin was studying at Moscow Aviation Institute, but he was expelled in 1981 or 1982, with his second or third year depending on the source. The reasons for his expulsion are vague. Some sources mention his anti-Soviet poetry, others cite a rumor that he had robbed university apartments with a group of friends. Regardless of which version is correct, Dugin probably benefited from paternal protection. Dugin was subsequently declared psychologically unstable, which enabled him to escape possible prosecution, as well as excused him from military service. There is scarcely any information about Dugin's activities after he was expelled from the Aviation Institute. He has said that he worked as a concierge and gave private English and French lessons. Other sources have him working as a translator for second tier organizations such as the Institute for Information on Trade or the Institute for Economic Prospects. There is scant information about the circle's activities through 1980s. A group sharing similar tastes in music and literature took shape in Leningrad, while two currents emerged in Moscow, Bonanian principles. Division appeared within the first current. Dejmal became increasingly involved in Islamic revival in Central Asia and participated in the birth of the clandestine Islamic Rebirth Party of the Soviet Union. He traveled to Dusham, Dushanbe in 1980 to meet with Islamic clerics and began printing underground Qurans that were sent to the Central Asian republics. Dugin thus remained the driving force behind the Nazi oriented branch. The circle was active until at least 1988, still with the same cocktail of leadings of Arthur Rimbaud, rock music, and political debate. It broke up gradually during the last Perestroika years, with the new freedoms of speech and association leading its key figures to take up dissociated professional paths, journalism, art, music, or politics. There are more details about Dugin's biography starting in 1988 when he joined the National Patriotic Front Paymat alongside Dejmal. Upon the advice of Golovin, Paymat was the cottage school of Russian nationalism, an extraordinary incubator of all radical ideologies. Paymat's most direct predecessor, the Vitiatsi group, the Valiant Ones, formed in 1978, include the All Russian Society for Protection of Historical and Cultural Movements in order to prepare for the dissident celebration of the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kulikovo. Petitsier was mainly concerned with historical tourism and organized excursions to sites related to Russia's major military victories. In 1980, Payment was registered in Association of Bibliophiles within the Ministry of the Aviation Industry, organizing evening events devoted to writers, historians, and painters of a nationalist persuasion. These took place either at the House of Culture or the Ministry of the Aviation Industry or at the A.N. Ostrovsky Museum, afterwards at the Palace of Culture at the Moscow Metro. With Dmitry Vasilyev's ascendance to the top of the organization in 1984, Parliament went from being a cultural organization to an engine of anti Semitic propaganda obsessed with fight against Zionism. From 1987, the association fractured into multiple competing groups, all of which laid claim to legitimacy acquired during the movement's first years. Dugin joined Vasilyev's faction and even had a seat in the Central Council for several months. Nonetheless, he was quickly expelled from Payment along with Dejmal for Satanism and anti Soviet intentions, at a time when the association had largely reconciled with then imperial regime. The accusation of Satanism probably refers to Dugin's Nazi symbolism and the Black Order rituals of the Golovin Circle. Dugin's joining Payment indeed coincided with the first appearance of Nazi symbols within the Russian nationalist movement, but these attempts to propagate Nazi occultism were doomed to fail. At the time, at that time, Russian nationalism defined itself chiefly as Russia's path distinct from the West, or as defense of the Soviet Union against the German enemy, thereby marginalizing all those who were promoting pan-European ideologies. In 1989, Dugin joined a small group, the Movement for Intellectual Conservatives, led by Igor Dudinsky, a journalist and literary critic close to dissident circles, who had been a regular participant in the Golovin Circle in the 1960s and was close to the Russian emigre in Paris, especially Vladimir uh, Kotlярov. During the last months of the Soviet Union, Dugin tested out of various niches from which he hoped to influence the political scene. In 1991, he tried to take part in the anti-Gorbachev conservative putsch through his contacts with Deputy Viktor Alskinas, representing the pro-Soviet group Soyuz. He also began to publish the main conservative newspaper of the time, Den, in July 1991, and was promoted to its editorial board in December of the same year, thanks to his long-standing relationship with Alexander Prokhanov. Dan was Dugin's main link with the major politicians who occupied the Russian nationalist scene at the onset of the 1990s, especially Gennady Zyoganov and Vladimir Zhirinovsky. However, the newspaper was too pro-Soviet to be an effective vehicle for spreading all of Dugin's ideological precepts. After the Iron Curtain opened, Dugin pursued his own path, interacting with Western ideologies and ideologists, and contacted the political heirs of traditionalism. His first trips to France, Belgium, Spain, and Italy between 1989 and 1993, probably organized thanks to Mamlev's networks in Paris, allowed him to meet with members of the French and Belgian New Right, such as Alain de Benoit, Robert Stukers, and Jean Triot, as well as members of the Spanish Thule Group and a successor to the defunct neo-Nazi organization CEDADE, and with Claudio Monti himself in Italy. Dugin had fewer contacts within the new German New Right, and even if he was drawn to historical figures of Nazi mysticism, such as the famous thinkers of Germanic Arianism Guido von List and Jörg Lons von Liebfels, and to a greater extent Hermann Wirth. Wirth had founded Ahnenerbe, the SS Allied Research Institute, in charge of creating the Aryan ideology for the Nazi regime. Didn't know that. Which had organized many archaeological expeditions in search for Urkulturen, the original culture of the first Aryans. These Germanic elements were not embraced by Mamlev and Golovin, and became associated with Dugin's own ideological brand. Although the Germanic influence has long made him a pariah within the main nationalist groups, Dugin has remained faithful to his Nazi inspirations. After the failure of Paimat and his inability to steer Den towards his theories, Dugin tried to launch his own platform. He founded the Arktogaya Association, as well as the publishing house of the same name, and set up a center for metastrategic studies to reach the military establishment. In 1991, he published two almanacs, Gipperboria and Millie Angel, based on the intellectual heritage accumulated during the years of the Golovin Circle. Gipperboria, the subtitle of which read The Intellectual Press Organ of the New Forces of the North, openly invoked the Nazi ideological legacy and its occult roots, and claimed to be the Russian version of the Spanish newspaper the same name published by Tula. Millie Angel, whose subtitle is Metaphysics, Angelology, Cosmic Cycles, Eschatology, and Tradition, is dedicated to the diffusion of traditionalist thought. Alimenti, launched a few years after, drew its inspiration from a French New Right journal with a similar name and displayed a less Nazi oriented bent. Dugin continued to promote the Ahnenerbe narrative with a Secrets of the Century series of documentary films hosted by the conservative journalist Yuri Vorobevsky on channels 1 and 4 in 1992. The first episodes were devoted to the mysticism of the Third Reich. Dugin served as a key expert commentator throughout, claiming to have accused or accessed some of the KGB's Ahnenerbe archives in Moscow. This was both Dugin's first television appearance and first presentation of Ahnenerbe to the broad Russian public. And The Mystery of Eurasia, 1991, The Hyperborean Theory, 1992, and The Philosophy of Traditionalism, 2002, Dugin resumed his explanations of the Aryan theories of an all-original Hyperborean civilization. He also interpreted runic writings as a kind of Aryan grail written in the universal proto-language supposedly discovered by Wirth in 1933, and the Chronicle of Uralinda. Dugin thus remains faithful to his ideological trajectory and has never renounced his attraction to esoteric Nazism. The Golovin Circle, this is chapter 4, the revival of the Circle's ideology and networks. The Circle's formal meetings ended at the turn of the 1980s, 1990s, when each member followed his own path and political path, but the leaders' personal connections were not broken. And the following decade, the intellectual heritage of the Circle was reconstituted on two occasions: the creation of the new university in Moscow by Dugin, Mamlev, who returned to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Golovin and Dejmal in 1998, and the foundation of the Florian Geyer Club by Dugin and Dejmal in 2011. The creation of the new university in 1998, on Dugin's initiative, had two objectives. The first was to generate a new means of diffusion for traditionalist ideas, as the classic platforms, books, and journals had proven relatively unsuccessful and fairly costly. The second was to help Dugin launch his career as a professor, a strategy which bore fruit in 2008 with his appointment at the Sociology Department of Moscow State University. Notice Steve Bannon doing the same thing uh, with Gloria Turner-Taxis and with this backing from notorious Masons and people aligned with the Pan European movement. And Cardinal Burke said he's not going to have any of this and left the whole thing. But being pushed by traditionalist Catholic circles, including AIDS positive Sir Michael Voris, and all in all, same kind of ideas, but interestingly, called Judeo Christian West. Um, so, because of the Kalergi pan European heritage, I think that this is the pro Jewish right wing uh, traditionalist fascist movement. And so Bannon and Dugin have a few different differing opinions on things, but going on. Although Dugin pompously presents himself as the provost, rector of the new university, a quick look at the university structure is enough to see that the title is misleading. The supposed university is nothing more than a small association that organizes seminars on an irregular schedule. For a long time, the association has no fixed address. It held its classes at different locations around Moscow before establishing itself as ArtPlay, a design center that offers art exhibitions and functions as a commercial mall for design stores. It is likely that the new university only leases the space and has no ideological links with the ArtPlay's administration. The classes draw around 100 people and are rebroadcast on Dugin's websites, Dugin TV and Evrazia TV. On its site, the new university features four professors, Manlev Golovin, who passed away in 2010, Dugin, and Dejamol. Among second-ranked personalities, Sergei Zigalkin, a close friend from Golovin and a member of the circle since 1960s, has also reconnected with the group and given lectures on philosophy of science and mathematics. The core of the circle is thus reunified, and proposed lectures reflect the main debates that animated the circle's evenings. The key authors to be read are Guanan, Evola, and Heidegger. The central themes are tradition, Hermeticism, Logos, the Russian Dasein, being in the world. Um, like I said, watch Taxi Driver. That is about being in the world, and I guess being in the world is also about being an incel. Magical geography, and so on. Most recently, Dugin added actually being in the world. Dasein, if you ever hear that, that's what it's talking about. Is a basis. Being in the world came from the Nazi Party's official philosopher Heidegger, um, but is actually the basis for the Jesuits' um, liberation theology. Um, not so people who say, "Oh, the communists took over the church and created liberation theology," that's boomers. That is a boomer tier argument. Um, there's a direct link from Heidegger to liberation theology. So anyway, going on. Uh, Magical geography, and so on. Most recently, Dugin added lectures on the subjects he taught at Moscow State University: the sociology of language, imagination, and international relations. Mamlev developed his own syllabus called The Patriotic Teachings of Eternal Russia, which he then synthesized in his work Eternal Russia. The book explores the specificity of the Russian soul, the need for moral and spiritual renewal, and the messianic vision of Russia based on the Russian idea of Dostoevsky and Solyov as an inclusive worldview. Mamley's post-Soviet narrative is the indicative of the former underground intelligentsia that suddenly reconciled themselves with more classic versions of Russian national identity. Mamlev also sought an academic niche, eventually teaching Indian philosophy in Moscow State Philosophy faculty from 1994 to 1999, a topic that is obviously inspired by his attraction for Hyperborean and Aryan themes. More recently, in 2011, the Circle tried to create a second platform called the Florian Geyer Club. Forming clubs became fashionable in Russia in the second half of the 2000s when the Kremlin sought to sponsor think tanks capable of providing doctrinal support for regime views. The Florian Geyer Club is directly linked to the ideologue heritage of the Circle. Its name references the nickname of the Third Reich's 8th SS Cavalry Division, which was deployed on the Eastern Front in 1943 to 44, which itself referenced a figure from the German Peasants' War of the 16th century. As during its underground era, the Circle plays on symbols and language. Its members say that the club is named after the 16th century aristocrat who led a peasant revolt and who reflects the meeting between the extreme left and the extreme right. Synarchy, Jacobinism, that Dugin has always supported. Others cite a song of the same name by the band Rammstein, which is known among some young alternative circles, while others assume it is a Nazi symbol, not from the Eastern Front, but the left wing of the Nationalist Socialists who were pro Bolshevik. Otto Strasser. Dejmal and Dugin dominate the club alongside Maxim Shevchenko, a member of the public chamber who was not part of the circle. It draws on the longtime allies such as Alexander Prokhonov, Edward Limonov, and Claudia Muti, as well as new generations of sympathizers such as the leading television propagandist Mikhail Leontev. Mikhail Kazin, an economist close to Leontev and member of the Eurasianist International Movement, journalist Israel Shamir, the man that has developed what the ADL calls a working relationship with E. Michael Jones, as well as um, obviously longtime associate of that idiot stoner looking guy that released all the leaks, WikiLeaks guy. What the hell's his name? Julian Assange. Uh, Tranny Assange. Um, Interesting. Very interesting. Who is known for his anti Semitic remarks. I mean, he is Jewish, but okay. National publicist Maxim Kalashnikov and Boris Medzuev, close to Gleb Pavlovsky, and involved in his main media platforms now as deputy editor in chief is Vestia. Some figures who are totally removed from the idea of the club, such as historian Igor Chubayas and leftist sociologist Boris Garlitsky, who may have been invited to join, or they have been invited to join. The same is true for the successful writer Mikhail Lizarov, who forms a link with underground cultural circles. In total, between September 2011 and July 2012, the club organized 5 seminars. It then ceased its activities and was absorbed in the more significant and politically better connected Izborsky Club, which includes almost 30 of the main conservative ideologies and politicians under Prokhonov's umbrella. As is often seen in Russia, attempts to openly associate with the rehabilitation of fascist and or Nazi theories are in short in duration and then merged into nationalist narratives that enjoy greater consensus. Conclusions. The Golovin Circle was the first attempt among dissidents to bypass the tradition dividing line between westernizing liberals and nationalist monarchist Stalinists. At first, it considered that it was the reply to the Soviet regime, but was found not in rival political ideology, but in metaphysics and the search for another level of reality. So it is not against the Soviet regime, but rather wishes to subsume it into a new metaphysical level. This trend became more powerful in the 1960s and 1970s and was encapsulated by the fashion for Oriental religions and mysticisms, Blavatsky and Ririk, shamanism and Tibetan mythology, UFOlogy, and so on, similar in many ways to the New Age wave that swept Western countries around the same time. In the atmosphere, the circle distinguished itself by its preference for European mysticism, medieval esotericism, and Western authors embodying German Romanticism and vitalist ideologies. This initial path also allowed for the rediscovery and assimilation of main advocates of traditionalism, mostly Rene Guénon and Julie Savola, and their political heirs whom fed the German conservative revolution of the 1920s on Nerba inspired Nazi occultism and post war fascist doctrines in Italy and Latin America. In their memoirs and interviews, Mamley of Golovin, Dejmal, and Dugin acknowledged their violent rejection at the time of the Soviet reality and official ideology. Discovering powerful counter narratives seen as a taboo in Soviet society could only be attractive to spirits in search for nonconformism and provocation. Their spiritual quest as a response to the Soviet regime progressively transformed into assimilating and promoting new political doctrines. Over 3 decades, the Golovin Circle evolved from Mamley's encounter with metaphysics to Golovin's discovery of the political side of traditionalism to Dugin's revisiting of Nazi mysticism in the attempts to transform it into an engine for concrete political activism. The Circle's network survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and succeeded in using the new freedoms offered by post Soviet Russia to continue its mission that it began several decades prior. Its main leaders played a significant role in introducing the European anti Enlightenment tradition to Russia, and Dugin pursues this trend today, for instance, translating the works of Heidegger and publishing books on him. They are created in international networks of communication with current representatives of the thinking in Western Europe, that proved to be robust over time. Dugin continues to interact closely with Evola's descendants in France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. The circle's reference to Nazi culture took a disguised form in 2011 when Dugin and Deschamps named their club after Florian Geyer. Both remained faithful to the authors who founded fascist thought in Europe, even though they coupled them with other ideologies, Eurasianist for the former, Islamic for the latter. The only profound change since the underground decades is that their virulent anti Soviet stance has been transformed into a nostalgia for Soviet culture and great power. During Soviet decades, the circle's philosophical theories were very marginal. Although they fascinated a small number of nonconformist intellectuals, they were too radical and too anti Russian or anti Soviet to attract a large number of followers. Today, the ideological landscape has changed. The precepts of traditionalism and conservative revolution ambivalently echo some of the Kremlin's appeals for a new conservative ideology. Along with the electoral success of populist parties in Western Europe, this change of the atmosphere has created a new window for the Circle's heirs to interact with Europe and to see some of their arguments fruitfully integrated into larger ideological coalitions. Okay. I am very interested in this MI6. John Bennett. Guy who is likely smuggling esotericist literature into the Golovin circle. It's very interesting. Um, as it tends to be British intelligence that promotes this kind of thing. Uh, I mean, if you want to confuse yourself and uh, give yourself a headache, go ahead and read Alexander Dugin's Fourth Political Theory. But yeah, no, it would be worth a read. So that's it. We're at an hour 08. That's the first article. If I decide to read the other articles tonight, I will. I think the other ones are substantially shorter, but this is the first in the series, and I think that gives a pretty good basis for the Russian side of things. Like I said, the articles by Pierre Bildry and others on the fascism around Seinef and of the liberal Dennis de Rogemont, Swiss fascism, and circles around Alan de Benoit. We can and John Friart. We can go into at a later time. But thank you for watching, everybody. I think people are still lost in that other live stream that I shut down over an hour ago because I froze. So I wonder what kind of alternative hermetic reality they're viewing on that blank screen. Have a good night. Like and subscribe. Tell your friends to like and subscribe. Um, Once I set up a PayPal link, please send me YouTube bucks. I don't know if the Trump bucks are coming in. I desperately need money to buy more $1,000 suits. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Bye bye.